Yeah, don't do that, dude.
Welcome back to episode 224 of the Tall Boy Radio podcast. And as we always say, who knows where it goes when the beer flows? Wow, it's flowing all the way to the Big Apple. But before we get to that, let me wish everybody out there who's celebrating and watching the live stream tonight a happy Cinco de Mayo. We don't call it that in the UK. We call it Dave's 51st birthday. Dave, one of the other hosts, who can't be with us tonight. Well, happy birthday, Dave. Knocking on in years. Here's another man knocking on in years. Gazza, how are you doing?
Whoa, dude, what's all that about? You've set me up for a right one there. I'm good. You say I'm knocking on in years. I'm a good 2 weeks older than you are, as they say. And I suppose you can say, yes, I'm knocking on in years. But yeah, all good, dude. Looking forward to this, and it's always amazing when we have guests on the show, and in particular new guests that we haven't had on before. So I'm really, really, really looking forward to it. Can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to where this is going to go and what we're going to talk about, and I'll leave it up to you to introduce who it is.
Indeed. So there's Gaz Trailed, a new guest. What a similar thing we've covered up before. We had a chap on in the past by the name of Vic Ferrari. He used to work in the NYPD, and he put us in touch with an old colleague of his. John, did you want to say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hello to all. Me and Vic didn't actually work together. I read his books and we connected, and we're cut from the same cloth, me and Vic. He was NYPD, I was NYPD. He was an auto crime detective. I did a little different work, but we both retired, and we both have very similar stories to tell.
Indeed. And as we were discussing earlier, so two departments that you worked in were internal affairs and missing persons. And I guess the first thing to say, and I've heard you say it yourself actually when I watched you on Vic's podcast, is the interesting thing about missing persons is, although we think about the police as solving crimes, that this is a department which deals primarily with something that hasn't necessarily been or seen a crime committed.
Correct. Most missing person cases are not a crime, and a lot of writers are writing it as a crime. It does happen, but the vast majority of them are for separate situations. A person who simply just goes out on the weekend and can get hurt, can get lost, goes missing. We have, unfortunately, a lot of suicides. None of those are a crime unless someone else does that to them to make them go missing. But we investigate them all, and then if it looks like a crime, we will investigate it as a crime. But the vast majority are located right away. I would say 90 to 95% within the first week. It's those other 5% that we really had to put a lot of work into to find out where this person actually was.
Wow. And about how many people go missing a week, dare I ask, in New York City, or at least when you were investigating it?
It's a hard number to place, but because there's a lot of things that go on. There's a lot of 911 calls of someone missing, and they're found pretty quickly. So technically, it doesn't make it to a report. So that doesn't get listed. What they would do is the NYPD, with the officers on patrol, would take the missing person case, and if they realized there was a missing person through their brief investigation, the precinct detective would handle it for 7 days. After those 7 days, they would send it to my unit where I worked, which was the missing person squad. I was a sergeant in that unit. I had 7 detectives who worked for me, and there was other sergeants, detectives. We would get 7,000 cases a year. It just in my unit alone. Now, that's a very low number because we're not counting what didn't make it to us for that week. So out of our 7,000 cases, like I said before, 90 to 95% were solved right away. We knew which case. We used to call it, hit the ground running, or the bells and whistles are going off. We knew when those cases came. That would be a young child. The younger, the more we would run out right away, say under 10 years old, that just didn't come home from school. autistic child, anything with a kid, or if it was very obvious there was a crime. They did happen sometimes when there could be a husband and wife situation, and we really felt that this person is reporting this, but something bad happened, which would be a crime, and we'd get out on that very quickly.
Yeah. So,
sorry, I was sorry, John. I was just going to ask, in terms of, you just said that, you might have missing persons. How soon do you cross over between missing persons and, I suppose, homicide, in terms of, like, do you have to hand it over to them? Do you investigate and then say, actually, yes, we think there's some skullduggery or whatever it is that's gone on? And then at what point do you hand it over? Because I suppose, they're missing persons and then something happens or something doesn't happen. So you must liaise quite closely with lots of other departments in the NYPD.
Correct. You asked an excellent question. We do work with a lot of other departments. We worked with a lot of sex crimes, trafficking, human trafficking type of stuff.
Yeah.
We would deal with those quite often, more than any other unit. When it came to homicide, I could give you a case example when a person was reported missing and he was an adult, but he had told family members he wanted to commit suicide. So,
right.
Very odd story. He was found by some teenagers who found him in the park. And when we were interviewing them, they thought we already knew that we found him, which was strange. But they said, "Oh yeah, that's the guy in the park." And we were like, "What guy in the park?" So the detectives went there. The way the body was located, it looked staged. It looked like somebody. This was not a suicide. It looked like he was murdered somewhere else and placed there. And
right.
From my experience, it was too perfect. So we called in the homicide detectives at that moment. He was no longer missing. He was considered found. So if it's a crime, the homicide had to make that decision at that moment. Right. Example like that would be homicide, or we would get a lot of, missing prostitutes that they would be missing for 2-3 years. And then somebody moves out of an apartment and the landlord says, landlord calls 911 and goes, "You got to see what's in the closet." So we had cases like that in the closet, in the attic, more than one case like that, when somebody moves out of apartment and they had that prostitute there dead for 2 years.
Wow, really?
Yeah, I'm not saying common, but I've seen more than one of those cases.
Jeez.
That's pretty shocking, isn't it, dude?
One was in the attic of a home, and one was, I believe, in the closet, if I can remember exactly. We found others on the floorboards too of homes.
But I mean, the flip side of that, can you imagine moving into a house and thinking, oh, something's going on here? What's all this about? I mean, bloody, wow, geez, that's bad.
Yeah, that's unfortunately that, when prostitutes do go missing, it's not uncommon, but
yes, yeah,
they do show up. If they're not arrested, went back to their family in a drug rehab, when it comes to prostitution, if they stop doing prostitution, they're going to start collecting on their Social Security and they're going to start collecting benefits. So if someone's not collecting benefits and they're not getting arrested, they haven't gone in drug rehab and no one's found them, you got to realize that we used to say they just got in the wrong call. So unfortunately, sometimes it takes time, but we've had cases like that when construction on a home and they'll find somebody. It's sad, but it's a very dangerous business people get into.
Yeah. Wow.
Man, that's crazy.
That's a case that would go to homicide after we closed it. We would close the missing person, case closed, we give it to homicide. They would definitely get all our information and we would help them, but homicide never gave a case to us. We always gave it to them.
I literally was about to say, so it sort of wouldn't go the other way around, because the missing person, we found them. Yeah, they happen to be dead, but okay, so then we need to investigate that sort of thing. So
yeah, because within my book, if you read the story, I wrote one about a guy under a mattress, which was, his wife was reporting him missing, and it was at first we weren't going to take the report, but she really wrote some good letters. And what happened was he had a heart condition, so we figured, okay, he passed away somewhere, but there was a ticket to his car. The name of the story was he's under the mattress the entire time. So there was tickets to the car on his vehicle. So we kept going to the location. So I wasn't there when they found him, but I was conferring with a detective who said he kept knocking on the door. And I think after about the third time he knocked on the door, the guy goes, "All right, just come downstairs." So they went downstairs and there was a pile of mattresses and I don't know how many it was, but he was under the pile of mattresses dead. So we determined that he was doing drugs in the basement, died of an overdose. And these guys were such hardcore drug addicts that they just piled mattresses on top of him and they continued to party.
Wow.
So then the cop humor came in because the guys I work with were like, there's some hardcore crackheads in that basement, man. And, you know, a lot of guys I worked with did narcotics and they kind of were like, yeah, I could see that happening. So I don't know what happens. The precinct detectives handled that. They might have charged him with like disposal of a body or something. I don't know, because we didn't think it was a homicide, but it was definitely a very odd situation. I don't know what kind of friends those were, but that's what happened.
Wow.
Yeah, not very good friends is the honest answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting there that you say about that almost black humor that cops have, and and I found exactly the same thing when we spoke to Vic. You talk about these things very, very matter of fact, and to us, because who don't deal with it, thankfully, day in, day out, you know, we find it, you know, shocking, the idea of, you know, a house with the body of a hooker in the basement or a cupboard, you know, that is, you know, unbelievable. You know, we picture it, we probably feel the emotions of the person who's passed there and what have you. Dude, how do you deal with that? How do you compartmentalize it?
Well, you know, I get what you're saying, because obviously most of the people I know are not police officers. They don't get the cop humor, and all cops have some version of the cop humor. Some call it gallows humor, police humor. It's written about quite often in books, which is usually correct. It's in the movies quite often. But I will say, you know, anyone that's viewing this, oh, these cops are making fun of everything. It's not the case. It's never done in front of a family. It's with names are never given. You can never find out who's we're talking about. But I guess it's a release of the stuff that you are forced to see, because I wrote about it in my book that a police officer will see, a New York City police officer, I believe police officers anywhere, but especially NYPD, everything's thrown at you quick, and you don't really have a chance to get to know it. We will experience more within the first week or within a month than a person will see in a lifetime.
Yeah.
So in the police academy, they get you ready for that. They start with showing you videos of police officers in crazy shootouts. And unfortunately, they show you the ones who didn't survive the shootout. And they show you that because they warn you that this can happen to you. You're going to be in bad situations. It's hard to watch, but you learn from it. Then they show you the videos of the officers that survived the shootout. But at the same time, they show you the crime scene pictures. And then it gets even better. They don't do this anymore in the police academy, which I believe is a mistake. They take you directly to the morgue. And they take you with the sergeant. Then they show you everything. You see an autopsy. You see it all. And only in the NYPD, they're like, okay, guys, I hope you had a great time. You're on lunch. See you in an hour. And they put you on a lunch break. And then I'm like 2 months into the police academy. I'm eating my lunch after I just saw this madness happen down the block, which was in the morgue. And then we're eating lunch, and I'm like, my gosh, I'm becoming a police officer already. And when you go home, you can't tell your family about this. You can't, because they're going to look at you like, did you choose the right career? This doesn't make sense. And then you slowly learn, but when you get to the street, it hits you quick. Like I said, you could walk right out the gate and get involved in stuff. Doesn't mean it has to be dangerous or life-threatening, but you're getting involved in other people's trauma. And people don't call you when they're in their best mood or when they're the best things going on. You can have a husband and wife who are great people, but something bad just happened and they called you to the scene. And you got to kind of be a social worker at times and handle these things. So when you go home, you know, the TV likes to portray the cop who's divorced, who's a drunk, he's arguing with everybody. Those things definitely happen, but that's not the norm. Most cops, they'll joke about it with their coworkers. I'm not saying we hold it inside, but we'll talk about it in situations like this, but it can't be talked about when someone's not prepared for it.
Yeah.
I just find it. I say I'm going to laugh. It's an inappropriate laugh, but let's just go and grab like a pastrami sandwich or whatever it may be, and oh yeah, you know, we've just come out of the morgue and we're just looking at loads of bodies and this, that, and the other. And yeah, let's just go up the local, like, you know, whatever it may be, sandwich shop or deli shop or whatever. We're just going to grab a sandwich and just, yeah, everything's all okay. And I'm a bit like, wow, and as you said, John, it's like that's just what happens. And for me, that's just mind blowing. It's just incredible that you can just go from one thing to the next. And I just don't. I'm not in that world. I don't get it. I don't understand it. If that makes sense.
No, it makes sense to me that you don't understand it because that's why I believe people read a lot of true crime because they want to see the world and they want to understand it. Now, it's not always lunch. It could be just a cup of coffee. There was many times we're sitting there with a cup of coffee and the call would come, assault in progress. You get there and there's a very serious assault and someone looks like they might die and your partner might make the arrest. You handcuff them. The partner takes the arrest. The person survives, so it's not major where you have to be involved because if the partner takes the arrest, if there's no crime scene, which quite often happens, like it's another thing the movies are getting wrong, it's not always a crime scene. So there's no crime scene. I would go back to the coffee shop and finish my coffee. And the person who's serving me the coffee, they'd be like, "Where'd you go?" "Oh, we had to go around the corner." I'm not going to tell them what just happened.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you see your partner later and he's asking you about the coffee. "Oh, did you finish your coffee? I got stuck with this."
Wow.
Just the way it is.
Yeah, that's great. So you mentioned people enjoying reading about true crime. So probably seems an appropriate time then that we should definitely mention your book, All in a Day's Work, an officer's accounts, 20 years in the NYPD. Tell us about that, dude. Tell us about some of the stories that stick with you that you wanted to put in that book.
The stories I put in that book were the stories that I told my friends about in the bar. That I know you guys call it the pub, bar, same thing. But it's the stories that my friends would ask me about. A lot of my friends were stockbrokers. They were teachers. They were in Wall Street. So, we grew up in Queens, New York. So it was a rough neighborhood. It wasn't a war zone, we called it, but it was a rough neighborhood. So we knew what went on in the world. So they would go, "What happened today?" I'm like, "You don't want to hear it." So they're like, "Well, what happened today?" So, I would tell them a funny story because I'm more of a storyteller type. And when I was in missing persons, we had a case when there was a family that was reporting a family member missing. And I felt that they had murdered the person and were trying to report it missing to throw off the crime. So, and we had to keep investigating. The story was very rehearsed. It was very to the point. When we ever tried to deviate from the story where this missing person was, they always went back to one aspect. So I told detectives, just keep going to the apartment, keep talking to them separately until someone starts talking to you. So the detectives would go out, and it was a joke. I would call them on the cell phone, and I would say, "Detective so-and-so, you there?" I'm like, "All right, when you walk in the apartment, if the floorboards start creaking, remember that spot because we're digging up that floor next week." And so this was in the person's house. So I would tell that story to my friends in the bar, and they would be like, "You need to write a book." And I go, "I already am." So those were the type of stories. Whenever someone, not whenever, but a lot of times when someone said that's a really interesting story, or they would ask me to tell it to somebody else, I was like, that story is going to go in my book. The problem was that I had so many incidents that were a very quick scenario, like before with the coffee and the person stabbed. It didn't make it to the book because there was such a condensed little thing. It happens everything because this is New York City. Things happen very fast here. In a New York minute, that term is for a reason. Everything is quick, happens. So a crime could happen very quickly. The person could get caught very quickly, and they're already getting fingerprinted within the hour. So it's hard to write about that situation because it happened too quick. There's not much to it besides quick situation.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's scary. So here's a question for you then. In terms of missing people, do they still do it? It's harking back to the movies and TV series and a little bit of TJ Hooker maybe. But
Not TJ
Hooker. Not necessarily.
He used to throw a nightstick. Remember that? I never saw that ever.
No, I know. He was very successful doing it. It didn't seem a very practical use of it, to be honest with you.
William Shatner is great. Anything that guy does, but I've never seen that done. And if it was, I think that officer would be in trouble.
I can imagine.
Can I just put on record that us guys at Toolboy Radio love William Shatner, by the way. William Shatner is amazing, and everything he's been in, he's like an amazing guy. So I'm just going to put that on record.
He's one of the few people I'd love to meet. He seems like a very funny guy. Yes. He played a cop good, but someone like him has to put the humor in it because that's his character.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey, if somebody's going to throw a nightstick, it might as well have been Captain Kirk.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, one of the things you see, faces on milk cartons. I believe it. I know it was a thing. Is it still a thing that they do now?
Interesting you brought that up. I worked the case of the first kid on the milk carton.
No, really?
Yeah, I could tell the story. I'll condense it. It was 1979. I wrote about this in my book. It's called One Phone Call 33 Years Later. So it was 1979. A kid named Eton Pates went missing in Manhattan, which was about 10 miles from where I lived. So, the 70s were very dangerous in New York City, and, heroin and everything else going on. It was a lot going on here, but a missing kid who just went to kindergarten class and never came home is serious. So it was on the news every night. That kid face was on the news every night, not yet on the milk container, but his face was on the news every night. He was around my age, and it just didn't say it. So the news was sensationalizing that case, which meant that they would take a little piece of the story, and I'm saying this because I know later on, which I'll get to it. They would take a little piece of the story and run with it. So there was allegations that the story got dark. There was allegations, which turned out not to be true, but that he was sold into slavery with children. So it was a creepy, dark story. And I'm going to tell you, they put this on the news at night, and they were like, cab drivers were saying, I drove him to an airport with adults in a car. So while I'm 9 years old watching this on television, I developed a fear of getting lost. And I developed a fear of getting lost and going missing. So I would tell my parents, what happens if I couldn't find you guys? And they're like, oh, you're fine. I was like, what if I get lost? What if I go missing? So for that summer of 79, I was afraid to leave my house because of that show on television, which was the nightly news about Eton Pates. Now I'm going to fast forward. I get assigned to the missing persons squad, and my supervisor calls me into the office and he shows me all the old cold cases, shows me a picture of Eton Pates, says, this kid in 1979 went missing, and this was his milk carton picture because he was the first kid on the milk carton. So when you brought that up, this is the case of the first kid on the milk carton. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, wow, that case that I was fascinated with as a kid and scared of, I'm now working on. So I did some work on the case. I dealt with the FBI a couple of times. I knew the lead investigator. And then I'm in the office one day and they were digging up a basement somewhere in another location. So I was a little annoyed that I wasn't part of the dig. So it was just me, one detective, and a civilian in the office. The phone rang. The civilian runs up, puts the phone down, runs up to me. And she goes, he knows where that kid is. So I thought it was another case of another kid I had. So the detective takes out his paper, starts writing. He's looking at me on the phone. He's writing. I see him writing Eton Pates on the case. Hangs up the phone. He goes, we just solved the Eton Pates case. So that caller called up and told us exactly who murdered that kid all those years prior. And they put him on the milk container after the case went cold. And for years, he was on the first kid on the milk container.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a story I had to write about in my book because it was just an unbelievable coincidence.
Yeah, that's scary. That is scary.
Wow.
How often did that happen then, that your cases were solved from anonymous or not even anonymous, but tip-offs?
Well, that's very common in crimes. We would call them confidential informants, which would be people who work for the department. I don't know how exactly it works, but they are, I guess, a paid informant. So that's not uncommon. I don't know if that was the case with what I explained, but I know that there are people that call. There are people with conscience. There are a lot of ex-prisoners who, I dealt with this when I was in internal affairs a lot. They heard a story from this guy for so long, and now they're in prison. They're like, listen, I don't care anymore. I'm just going to say what he told me. So that's not uncommon. Although with the prisoners, you really have to do a lot of work because their stories aren't always correct. But
right.
It's not uncommon for people to call anonymously or to call directly and tell you exactly what happened. And a lot of times that could solve a case. That solved a lot of our missing person cases. We would get calls in regards to missing persons with girls that were being trafficked. When I say trafficked, they weren't, the ones I noticed weren't like stolen from another country or nothing like that. They were just, they met the wrong guy online.
Yeah.
They met a guy online. She was 15, he was 30. And first she has an older boyfriend. And then, he says, hey, listen, this is the story all the time. It's like, you got to start paying the rent here. How are you going to pay the rent? Well, I have two friends going to come over. You're going to spend an hour with them. And then the next day, it's two more guys in a hotel. And then by the end of the week, she's on a train on a hotel. And somebody might call up and say, listen, there's a girl there. This is going on. It's wrong. Or the friends of the girl or the guy who's doing this might call up because they don't want to be charged with this crime. They're like, you got to go take this girl now because they don't want to be charged with it.
Sure.
So that's common.
So, question I had was I suppose, and you see it a lot on TV and this, that, and the other, and a crime goes out, and there's various little bits in terms of the media and people's awareness, and then you get loads of, I suppose, crackpots phoning in, and how prevalent, how often do you get like those guys that just, or women or whatever, that you must have like so many calls that you just, oh my God, this guy's like a whack job, this guy's a nut job, or whatever. And people just phoning in constantly. How do you sift through that and then, I suppose, get to the nuggets of information that actually are genuine and the guys that are just crackpots?
That is common. I'm glad you brought that up because I've talked about that on other podcasts. You get all types. We get psychics that called, and one good thing about a psychic is they will tell you that I am a psychic. So right off the bat, you might listen to them, but you know this can never go anywhere. I don't care what they tell you. You can't. I've had psychics call me up to tell me the location, the address, and where the body is. But I can't go dig up a floor because you saw this wherever, wherever it is. And, the psychics would call between 9, 10 o'clock at night. I don't know why. They always called late at night. And I don't know. I always ended up talking. I was working nights. So I was talking to them. The psychics were a little easy because you already knew what you were dealing with. There was other times, I could tell you a few incidents that we had people that would try to put themselves into the investigation.
Right.
Which means that I don't know their situation, their mental status, but they might have lived in the neighborhood, but somehow they are part of the investigation now. So they might call you and you have to really listen to them. And then you have to ask them direct questions. Okay, on this date and time, did you see this? No. Did it? And then after a while, you start to find out this person just wants to be involved in this case. And they're dangerous, those people, because they could really lead you in the wrong direction. And if they lie to you, that could be a problem. And I've seen that. And I didn't like those people because they're wasting my time. They want attention, and they're getting attention in a strange way. But we've had other people that if a reward's offered, the calls, if you offer a reward on a case, you might as well assign more detectives within 5 minutes because that phone's going to light up with everybody. And you have to really weed the out because people want to get paid. So I've had cases when, and I wrote about it in my book, where the reward found the person, but there's a lot of red tape in between that because you have to, just because somebody looks like somebody doesn't mean we're just going to stop everything and kick in a door.
Yeah.
If a girl lives in a shelter and's got sandy brown hair, that doesn't mean every girl in the shelter with sandy brown hair is this girl we're looking for.
Sure.
So I would say cops, and when I say cops, officers, the same thing. But when you get to detective and, you get to supervisor rank, you become very good at human nature. You almost have like a sixth sense. You can tell pretty quick on the phone what you're dealing with. Cops are very good at asking directly the question and fielding from the call where this person's going. I used to spend not a lot of time, but I used to spend time talking to them. I wouldn't dismiss them right away because you never know. Because like the case I told you about before with the kid, we listened to him on the phone and he solved the case through that. And that guy was convicted through that phone call. So it is something you have to do. They have tip lines and everything, but there's a lot of work in regards to those. You sold them crackpots. That's definitely the case. I've also noticed if a case hits the news, which means it could be a case in the California, and there's a theme to the case. It could be a woman who was married and she went on vacation with somebody else, and then she stayed on vacation and never came back. You'll start to get strange calls about people thinking that happened to someone they know. So which means that people are internalizing what they're watching on television and putting it into another case, and they confuse the two. So there's a lot of times I would interview somebody and they're almost describing what they watched on television and not what really happened.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They've watched too much TV and movies that they're putting it into their own situation.
Right.
And I used to say, are you getting this from television? Because that's not correct. So I noticed that a lot too.
So in effect, the more media attention you got, the more information you're going to get, but the less accurate and the more you had to sift through and the more work it's going to cost you in the long run.
Correct. But there are times you need it. It's especially in a situation with a missing young child at a young age, on any type of abduction, you're going to need the media. We have a thing here called Amber Alert. I don't know if you do anything, if you guys have in the UK, where they'll put signs on billboards on the highway where if a child is abducted or a person's abducted and they know the car on the plate, they'll put that on the highway and they'll flash it up. But that's only in a situation when they know the car, they know the plate number, and they know the people involved, or at least the description of the person involved. But the calls will just overwhelm you at the same time. But you have to be able to listen to the call and know pretty quickly, is this one going to be someone who has information, or is it going to be something that is just somebody who's concerned? I was pretty good at, and I noticed this when I was in internal affairs, if two people that do not know each other are calling and saying the same thing, and these people have no way of knowing each other and there's no information, those two people are very similar on the same. Because, you could be a person in another state. I'll go back to California. Two people in California called who don't know each other are saying the same thing. Then maybe there's a California connection because two people that don't know each other are saying that. So that's a good example of you'd have to pay more attention to those two calls.
So do you find that if it's a high profile case, for example, and excuse my ignorance, I don't know whether you've worked on any really high profile cases or not, but a high profile case, do you find that because of, in a way, the media coverage or the news coverage, that you would then end up with way more? So people phoning in because they want to be part of it, they want to feel, whereas if it was just, perhaps it didn't hit the high, the news reels or whatever, and it's just, oh my God, that's really disparaging. It's just somebody that isn't in the news, because every missing person is a missing person. But if it's high profile, do you find that there's a real sort of, I suppose, the more high profile it is, the more people that ring in and are crackpots as opposed to not?
Yes, that goes along with that, what we said before. The officers did not like when it went to the media, because it took away from what you were doing and it started wasting your time. And I could speak for the NYPD. I don't know about other police departments. It's very political here. So if a case gets to the news and it becomes political, you're going to have to start to listen to people that probably are not helping your situation.
Right.
And you can't just dismiss them because you never know. So there are times, like I said before, that it's good to have the media. There are times that you start chasing your tail around. And I would say many times I need more help on this because there's no way I could field all these calls.
Right.
And so it's a double-edged sword. I mean, every officer will tell you differently. I guess when a case is high profile, there's no way around it. You're going to get the media involved, and the media does guide the investigation, whether they are intending to do it or not.
Right.
Yeah. So what we've seen as well in the UK, I'm not saying it's commonplace, because there are a number of high profile cases. They made the media, they brought it in, the family members have gone on the news, and then maybe a week, 2 weeks, a month later, it transpires one of those family members are involved. Two questions. One, do you get a real good inkling from the start? The second, I've got a bad feeling about this one guy. And secondly, do you ever put them in the media and just let them hang himself for that reason?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, you stumped me on that one. I've seen it happen, and I've seen people that, well, I could speak for law enforcement. We will know pretty quickly if a family member we're not sure about, or we think they're not being truthful, or, cops can pretty quickly detect when you told a lie or you are deceitful or you're not saying what you want to say. People have mannerisms. People have a way of speaking. I'm pretty good at telling when a story is pretty rehearsed. It's obvious at times. So in regards to potentially putting them on the news, I'm sure that's been done, and it's a good tactic. I've never done it, but I have seen people go to the news and I go, wow, now we're getting a totally different story. Because I've had cases when I worked a missing person case when I suspected the family was separate from the one I told you before. There are two of them. There was one where I suspected the family had possibly murdered the person and reported them missing. And I would call them up and I would notice they'd go to the media. So I'm like, are you trying to deflect something here? But you can't prove it. So they can definitely, and the United States has numerous cases when people have gone to the media and that was used against them because they were lying to the media.
Yeah, I'll bet. Well, Gaz asked the question earlier about famous cases. The most famous case of them all. Did you ever receive any calls? Did you ever look at the case file for one certain Jimmy Hoffa?
That's like an urban legend. My gosh. Well, I wasn't expecting that question. He's definitely missing. He's definitely not been found. No, I never. That is one I've never gotten a call on. No, I will say I did find the case folder to the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case. If you're
wow,
really?
Yeah, I had access to that folder. That was an interesting one because I wrote about that in my book. And what happened was I found it on accident. And I wasn't even in missing persons yet. We were doing some data entry, and we were told to get these old reports and put them into the computers because the police department was being sued. So I was getting ready to get promoted. So they gave me this assignment, and I was with this other guy, and we were getting bored, and we were in this. Okay, well, we had to go to the basement of One Police Plaza, and there's a records room. So, like in the movies when the detective goes into the records room and there's like a civilian who's half asleep sitting there and is like, just go down there. So we went down a hallway full of files, made a left to another hallway, and then a room that was filled with files. And that's where we found what we were looking for. Now, no one told us where it was. We had to find it. So I'm making reports. I'm making copies of reports. My partner's making copies of reports, and we got it done pretty quick. So we're in this room. We're like, we're not going to call up our supervisor. Hey, we're done. What do you want to do with us? So we're like, let's just hang out. So we started joking around, laughing. So I look up, there's these file cabinets, and it says Lindbergh baby kidnap folder. So I'm like, wow. And I've watched that documentary on television. Now, I did know that a suspect who was convicted had lived in New York City. So I assumed it had something to do with that for him. So I had to climb the files. I had to climb the metal shelves. I actually climbed up it, took this file down. I don't know how long it's been there because that case was already 70 years old at the time.
Yeah.
And I opened it up, and it was all typewritten reports from detectives from the, the 20s and 30s. And they were typed. And even then, psychics were calling because I saw a report about that. I was like, wow, that's strange that had made it to here. So, and there was leads and tips, and there was interesting. Some things never changed because the detectives, even back then, were following leads about someone on the subway that was talking about a little kid. So the detectives would have to go to the subway station and look for that person to see if they could find them. There was neighbors who said that their neighbor just shows up with a child one day. So I sat there and I really went through that that file, and I was interested in it, but that was not actually what I was there to do that day. So I couldn't, really do any investigative work. That was a long closed case. So, I put the box back, I climbed back up, and I shoved it there. And I'm like, yeah, I guess 70 years from now, someone else will take it back down.
Wow. That's amazing.
It's a piece of history.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, absolutely. I was literally just going to say that's, that's a piece of, I suppose, missing person folklore, I suppose, if that's even the right phrase. Incredible that you had access to the file, you read it, you saw it. Okay, you maybe potentially didn't have the opportunity to act on it, but like for me, that blows my mind because that's like a really, really, really famous case. That is.
Yeah, there was at times we would, go into cold cases that were famous for the time, at least famous for New York City. And there was times that we would have cold cases and there would be serial killers in the United States. And you would have to wonder if that serial killer was in town during that time. And you would try to place it together. It's very hard to prove when something's 40 years old and a serial killer lived in the same borough at the time. But, you'd have to, it's hard because witnesses, they pass away, they forget, they go senile. Sometimes these cases will never be closed, but I would add to cases that this person was in town during this time and this person's a known murderer. And this needs to be looked at. Like I said, it's a cold case. The chances of coming up with anything on that. I wrote about that in my book. The chances of anything getting solved is slim, but you're at least telling the family that someone still cares and someone is still interested in your missing family members. Yeah. Because sometimes people have not talked to detectives in years, and we call them. I called a woman once, and as soon as she heard I was missing persons, the first thing she said to me was, it wasn't her daughter, it was her friend's daughter. First thing she said to me was, "You found the body." And this was after 20 years. And that was the first thing she said to me. And I said, "No, we didn't find it." But she hadn't talked to anybody in 20 years.
Wow.
That's difficult. That's got to be difficult, those conversations. And you do see it, you know, I'm probably as guilty as most, if not more than most, to be fair, of watching true crime documentaries. I very, very rarely watch anything else. They fascinate me, absolutely fascinate me. And I think it's that emotional side that sucks you into those people who were left there after you've watched that story, that are still living that existence day in, day out, waiting for that phone call. Are there any cases that you've dealt with? You know, if they're personal to you, that's fine. You don't have to share them. But are there anything that you often think back on? Any cases you wish you could have solved and just didn't? Because we always see a lot in a lot of detective dramas that there is like cases, that one cold case that bugs people.
Yes, definitely. And I believe that any detective who did the type of work I'm doing, especially with a homicide detective or someone who does sex crimes, there's always a case or two that you feel you were close to solving, or there was more information to obtain. And then you retire and you realize that I'm retired, somebody else is going to have to take that case. And you hope for the best, you really do, but you have to wash your hands of it and move on. So I had a case of a missing 10-year-old kid who just, walked out of his, he wasn't living with his family. Unfortunately, he was living with a foster family. He walked out into the hallway and never came back. And I wrote about that in my book. And I said how I wasn't the lead investigator. So I would have to quite often interview people who were somehow connected with where he lived. And we never came close to finding out what's happened. But I tried to go a different angle on that. But the police department didn't want to do it. They thought they should go one angle. I thought they should go another, but that's common. So I had one case, that I definitely retired and I would like to see it closed one day. But there's a lot of other ones that it's always in the back of my mind. And we had an interesting one. I'm not sure if you know about them. It was called the Gilgo Beach. It was he was a serial killer here in New York, and some of his victims were reported missing out of my office. And I always wondered. And then they had a suspect because they didn't have a suspect. They had the bodies found. So we had them missing. They had the bodies found somewhere else. And, he was just recently caught for DNA. And, my wife told me they solved the Gilgo Beach case. And I was like, wow. So that was one of them. And I didn't have a lot of knowledge on that, but that was one of them that I was like, wow, they really finally caught somebody on that. So I'm hoping the other ones, they will solve it.
Yeah, wow.
And I will say that I believe most detectives will tell you a similar story I'm telling you, that they have a case they still think about.
Yeah, I'll bet. And retrospectively then, like that, when you're talking about DNA, obviously with investigation, so, when we think about, the guys like Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle inventing the idea of tracking via fingerprints, and then that, became reality. Now we're looking at DNA. How much does get solved by, even just a body turning up or just something get re-examined? How much of that, how many of your cases get solved that way?
Well, I retired 10 years ago, so DNA was still, I know you guys back in 1988 in London was one of the first cases. So, but 10 years ago, DNA was still not where it is now. So they would swab the cheek of a missing person's family member. And then unfortunately, if it's a suicide, an example of that would be a body's found and it's so decomposed, you can't tell. The fingerprints are gone, everything, And just because they're wearing the same clothes, you can't tell your family, oh, this is your family member. You don't want to do that. You may have the wrong person.
Yeah.
So that's a good example of how DNA was solving those cases. And we were locating people through DNA. We used to call them DNA hits. And I know sex crimes has that too, where they have DNA hits. And that's, a lot of news stuff about that now. I think there's going to be a lot less cold cases in the future. I don't believe that someone like me is going to be talking about cold cases in the future, because a lot of cases I don't believe are going to go cold because of DNA, because they're going to know who the body is. It's not going to sit around in the morgue for all these years. They're going to find out who the body is. A sexual offense, they're going to get a DNA hit. Maybe not the hit of who it is, but they're going to get a DNA profile. So I think there'll be a lot less cold cases, and a lot of cases do get solved through DNA, but that is something that definitely Hollywood and the news, because it's interesting to watch, but it's not a tactic that's being used every day by every officer, but it's there.
Yeah, man. So I guess is that part of the challenge then in some cases when you're spending, I listened to your podcast that you did with Vic Ferrari and you talk about, Vic, it's a term I'd never heard before. It's a really grim one, the unclaimed dead.
Yeah.
It sounds like a really ghastly 70s horror film. But when you think about what it is literally the unclaimed dead. We don't know who they are, we don't know who or how they got there. But I guess is that the biggest challenge sometimes, that if you can find out just who that person is, you could probably solve the case from there.
You can, but there's a good chance you may not even find who they are, because New York City, we have a lot of transient people because New York City is a big city. People come here to work for whatever. So, if someone passes away as an old person and they never had any children and their parents are long gone, their DNA might not come back to a match. If they've never been arrested, their fingerprints are not going to come back to a match. And it's sad, nobody's looking for them or has been looking for them for a very long time. So that's what Vic was talking about. And those people, no one's burying them. So, we had the case, and we have a place where New York City buries those people, and there's filled there. And I guess every city in the U.S. or in the world has a similar situations when it's a sad thing, but those things do happen and they get unclaimed.
Wow, that's crazy. That's crazy. It's just, I guess it's because we're fortunate in the upbringing that we've had thus far, and we don't even think about that kind of stuff. So, yeah. So tell us a little bit about your time in internal affairs as well. I've got a funny feeling that if you were in internal affairs, you're not necessarily the most popular officer during that time.
I will say I lost some friends. Yeah. Well, I'm joking about that, because anyone who didn't want to talk to me because I was in internal affairs anymore was probably never my friends, because people that knew me knew that I was not. They used to call them rats. Rat was somebody who was just out to get everybody. I was never like that. I got there indirectly. What happened was I was a sergeant on patrol, and I was putting in for different units, and I was never an investigator. I wanted to be an investigator. So I put in a bunch of applications, and they were the only ones that took me. Now, unfortunately, they have a weird thing. I would say unfortunately, just how the NYPD works. They have certain places where if you put in an application, whoever takes you, you have to go. So I got pulled into internal affairs because I didn't have a phone call. My phone call didn't go and say, well, John doesn't want to go to internal affairs. He wants to go to detective bureau. So I was one of these people without the phone call in my background. So I had to give internal affairs 2 years. So I gave them my 2 years. Now, it was funny is when I talked about this on Vic's podcast, but it's such a funny story. As soon as I put in the application, my lieutenant, as soon as I put in the application, it's called Career Path. She said, if you put in this thing, you're going to internal affairs. I says, well, slow down. I'm just putting in an application for who wants me. She goes, if I sign this, that's where you're going. So I'm like, slow down. I'm like, whatever. So I walk away, and then like the next day, I got cops coming up to me. I heard you're going to internal affairs. I'm like, I'm on patrol in uniform. I'm like, I'm not going to internal affairs. What are you guys talking about? So I went home and I told my wife, I go, the rumor mill is already spinning here. I said, this is going to come back to me. I know it. So I get a phone call from a friend of mine who's not even a police officer. And he's like, are you going to internal affairs? And I'm on the phone with this guy. I'm like, is this a joke? What are you talking about? He heard it indirectly through somebody else. So,
Wow.
In New York City, everybody knows a cop somewhere because there's 30,000 of us here. So I figured out, I knew exactly who said it. So I went up to the guy and said, have you been talking to so-and-so on the phone lately? And he's like, what? I'm like, you know what I'm talking about. But I can't really throw it at him too much because it's off-duty stuff. So and then people are coming up to me on the side. They're like, when you get there, let me know what it's like. And I'm like, I'm not anywhere. I didn't get transferred. So I got transferred. A couple of people didn't say goodbye to me. They were just the type that, goodbye. A couple of people were like, John, it was like I was going off to war. They were like, John, I'll see you again soon. Like they were almost like, we can't talk to you till you're out of that place. So I went there, and then, I was always a big cop movie person my whole life. So, internal affairs is displayed in the movies a lot, and some of it's correct and some of it's not. But I was amazed within the first day the type of allegations I was hearing about. And most of them were not true against the officer. It could have been an ex-wife who was very angry, could be an angry neighbor, quite often a person they arrested. or they might have looked like somebody that was committing a crime, but it wasn't the cop. That was common. Or it could have been a police impersonator and the cop got blamed. So almost always the officer either did not do the crime or the allegation, or it was much less than they said, which means that the officer's being accused of a hit and run when you find out it was just not a hit and run. There was nobody injured. And it's like, if you got a dent on your car, is that really a crime? I'm like, come on. So, but you know, we had cases like that. Nobody was killed. So I used to say in internal affairs, the unbelievable is the believable, because there was a couple of cases that came through. I'm like, there's no way that's a police officer. There's no way a cop would do that. And sure enough, guys would say, listen, you know, that case you were working on, that was legit, and we're moving forward with it. I was like, wow.
Yeah. I suppose. Well, I mean, one of the, we sort of, I say, slightly sort of blinded by TV and movies and this, that, and the other in terms of what internal affairs looks like. But you hear some stories where, you know, there's a guy that was a traffic cop or whatever, and then he's gone to internal affairs, and all of a sudden he's investigating X, Y, and Z, and it turns out to be somebody that used to work with, or some, you know, a colleague, or this, that, and the other. And I mean, did that ever happen to you, where you went to internal affairs and a case came by you where you thought, oh crikey, and are you even allowed to investigate that if it's somebody that you know? Or is that allowed? Because in the UK, I suppose you would have something where it might be that actually you're probably not allowed to investigate that because you're too close to the case, if that makes sense.
Yes, I've never had one where I was too close to the case, and I've never seen one that was, but I'm sure it's happened because it's inevitable. Because I've seen numerous situations when I investigated cases with people I worked with, and like quite often, you know, you get the officer's photo and the name, and you're looking at it, and you're sitting there, you're like, I used to work with this guy, and you know, for whatever the situation is or whatever they did, you worked with this guy. So you have to put that to the side, because if they committed a crime or they committed a very serious allegation, you have to look at it. And if you can clear them, it's great, because I used to work with this guy. We were told when we first were in internal affairs that the officers you investigate will never understand the work you put in to clear them of any wrongdoing. They'll never understand that. They're only going to remember the time you worked a case where somebody got in trouble.
Sure. Yeah.
So that was common. And when I was in missing person squad, when I left internal affairs, I went to the missing person squad. I walked in the office, and there was two detectives who I had cases against.
That's got to be awkward.
I was like, hi guys, how you doing? I never sat next to the guy and said, hey, whatever happened in Brooklyn that time? I never did.
No. That would have been an awkward.
But to me, like, I don't know, you know, New York Police Department, you know, loads of cops, like so many. Do you not fly in people? But if something comes across your desk and you might know the person, do you not then contact somebody else and say, I can't investigate this, so therefore you bring somebody else in? And similarly, you get contacted to say, can you go and investigate that, because you might not know those people? And how does that work? Because as I say, it must be really difficult, like when something comes across your desk, particularly in internal affairs, where you think, actually, I know these people. That must be like really difficult. So are there safeguarding measures to make sure that doesn't happen?
I know of no safeguard measures where that can happen. It's interesting you say that, because I've had a couple of situations when I had cases and I'm like, okay, I know this person. So I think
how can that happen?
It's had to have happened to somebody else. I don't know of any safeguard, and you got to remember, there's 30,000 people in the NYPD. I don't think there can be a safeguard, because I've worked with so many people over the years. It's inevitable. You're going to have to work a case of somebody that you did. The closest I came to that was in missing persons, actually, where a detective approached me. Now, in missing persons, this is something that I can't explain. There's a lot of coincidences with cases when there's connections to these people and past cases. I can't explain it. I don't know why it happens, but I saw that quite often. I wrote about that in my book too. And detective approached me and said, another detective had a missing person of a missing woman. He said he used to date her. So
Wow.
I was looking at the detective like, really? And he's like, yeah. So he goes, can I get assigned that case? I said, I don't think you should even ask for that. I think you should leave that to somebody else who's not connected with it. I didn't get into any further on that. But that's the closest I came to when I was approached about that to work on a case that he had prior knowledge of the person. I told him, I don't think you should ask for that. I didn't have that final say on that anyway, but I don't believe he asked after I told him that. Oh, wow. So those things definitely can happen. I could say I've never worked on a case, on a major case where somebody got in trouble when it was somebody that I knew personally or very close. No, I never worked on a case.
But that must be really difficult though when you think about it in terms of, as you've just said, that must happen. So friendships get broken and families that grew up together, and I suppose, as I say in the movies and TV and stuff, you see it sometimes, and it's like, oh my god, like we've known each other for years, and all of a sudden a cop investigates this and finds out that X, Y, or Z is taking a backhander from the mob or whatever it may be, or this, that, and the other. And you think, crikey, that does that happen? Like, how often does that happen?
Well, like I said before, it's definitely happened. I'm sure that somebody has had to deal with that directly. It's inevitable. Human nature, Murphy's Law, whatever you call it, these things will happen at times.
Yeah.
So what about then, and moving away a little bit then from police work, well, only a little bit though. So in terms of PI agency, then you can tell us a little bit about that then, maybe. I don't know. How much of a crossover is there between that and police work?
Well, one good thing about private eye work is that you can pick and choose your cases. No one forces them on you. So I have a criteria. I don't do cheating spouse cases because I feel that there's way too much drama involved in that. And it's not worth it for me in retirement to, sit in a crappy hotel at 2 a.m. and take a picture of some loser coming out. It's just not my thing. And I spent enough time on surveillance following people to realize that I don't have the attention span for that, especially at that age. So what happened was when I retired, I didn't think I was going to be a PI. And then I was doing private security, and I networked with a lot of retirees like me who did the type of work I did. And they would constantly ask me about missing person cases. And I was like, listen, I've been retired a few years. I don't do missing person cases. But they were like, no, what should you do with this? And then I would explain to them, okay, let's do this. And it was almost like I never forgot how to do it. So during COVID, I got, everybody did interesting things during COVID. I decided to open up a PI business. So that was my thing. I went and I had I didn't have to do too much besides take an exam because I already had the criteria for my background. So I got the private eye license, and then I actually opened up my own company with it. And then I figured I was never going to be the person that had to take cases and take every case just to make the money. I figured I could pick and choose. And, it's not all about the money too. There's times that I really am helping out people. I had 2 very bizarre cases during COVID when women would move people into their apartments during COVID when you're locked down. And then as soon as COVID ended, these guys just took off. So normally that's not a case I take. I'm like, listen, if your boyfriend ran out on you, I can't help you. But you find out that the police aren't helping them. They don't know who these people are. So both of those cases I worked, and I told both of these women, I says, I cannot tell you if I find this person where they are, what they're doing, because I don't know what your intentions are. Things can happen. I don't want to be any part of that. So out of both of those cases, one of them was, I believe the guy was living in a more affluent house than he could comprehend because he grew up in a little apartment. As he got a little older, he moved in with this woman in another state and lived in basically a mansion compared to what he was in. And then when it came time for him to get serious, he ran for the door. So he wasn't a missing person. He just ran out of the relationship. The other one, I tend to think that maybe he had a family somewhere. So he lived with her rent-free for 2 years while he was sending money back home. And then same thing, when she wanted to get serious, he just took off. Both of those cases, those people, I was able to locate not directly where they are, but that they're still around and they're still operating, working and doing things. And I gave some answers to somebody, but it's not the answers they're looking for. Whatever family dynamics they had with that person during COVID. And both of those cases had no fraud attached to it. They didn't steal credit cards. They didn't steal money. There was no abuse because I asked that directly. Did they use your credit card? Did they assault you? Did they steal from you? None of that. It was just, they just totally ghosted them, where I moved everything out of the apartment one day and that was it.
Mad.
Wow.
Yeah, COVID definitely created some strange living environment situations.
Yeah. Well, it created a lot of very strange situations indeed, didn't it? Yeah. One final thing as well, because we like to wrap these episodes up round about the hour mark, but you said it was okay to ask you, so it would be remiss of us not to. So just September the 11th, obviously, was it's an event that impacted the world. It impacted us from a distance, just looking on and being shocked by what we were seeing. I'd just like to hear a little bit, if it's okay with you, of your first-hand experiences of it, and just some of the impact that you saw firsthand.
Sure, I could speak about it. It's no problem. I wrote about it. If anyone's interested, you could find it online. I wrote the story, and it's free. It's 17 pages of what I witnessed that day. Now, I will say before I even talk, I listened to you guys' prior episode, and I'm very impressed. You guys really, the way you described it, just from watching television, you really felt like you cared, and you cared for what was going on in New York City, and you guys are so far away. And I could hear it when I listened to you guys that it impacted you without you actually seeing it directly. You only saw it on television, but I did like that you guys talked about it the way you did, and it was caring, and gave you guys credit for that. So what happened was, I think about September 11th every single day since that day. It's never not crossed my mind in some way or the other. And, like today I was thinking about it because I knew I was going to be in your podcast and I was going to be talking about it. Now, I don't think about it negative because I don't want to, bring that on myself. I think about it like it was something I witnessed. It was something I saw. I decided very quickly I needed to write about it because I was already writing anyway. I wasn't a missing persons yet. I wasn't a sergeant yet in missing persons or internal affairs. I was still a police officer. So I was in that same building where I told you the Lindbergh baby kidnap case. I was in that building that day. And when I went to work that day, the weather was absolutely perfect. The sun was out. It was bright. There was no clouds. It wasn't even hot. So the weather was absolutely perfect. I remembered that day that I had to get fitted for a suit. So my mind was, I got to go to a wedding. I got to get fitted for a tuxedo. That's how my mind was thinking that day. And I took the bus, and my bus went close to I call it the Twin Towers because that's what we still call it as New Yorkers. Yeah. And the shadow of the Twin Towers from the sun was Lower Manhattan. And I walked past the shadow that day. It was quite ironic. So I walked past the shadow of the towers, and there was construction at the building I was in. So I went to the building, which was half mile, which is, I believe, about maybe 0.8 kilometers, if I'm correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, if I'm correct on the determination there. So I walked into my building and sitting at my desk, and my lieutenant approached me and he said, John, he goes, you got to pick up these reports you're doing. You're slow. I'm like, what are you talking about? So I'm like, and he just hands me a stack of paper. So I'm like, okay. So I went to my desk and I was like, I'm going to talk to that lieutenant. I want to find out what's going on, what he's talking about. I'm like, you know what, let me get started on my work first, because let me get myself a cool head before I say something I shouldn't. So I was still thinking about getting that suit that day. So I'm typing, and I heard an explosion. So I was like, that was a very loud explosion. So I thought construction fell off the roof of the building. So I went, a person I worked with yelled, you got to go see this. So he went to the window. I ran to the window. And when I ran to the window, I saw a giant hole in one of the towers. And I had even though it was above where I was standing, my office, I was on like the 9th floor. Obviously the towers were a lot higher. I saw this hole and I immediately saw black smoke, like 100% dark smoke shooting out and up. And there was papers shooting out of the building. And these papers were getting carried by the wind out. And I said, this is not normal. This was not an accident. Somebody put a bomb in that building. So I said, I immediately thought, oh my gosh, my wife is working in Manhattan. I got to go tell her what's going on. So I went downstairs. I didn't have a cell phone yet. It was 2001. I didn't have a cell phone yet. So I went to the payphone, put a quarter in the phone, told my wife on the phone. I said, she knew how close I was to the building. She didn't know yet. It didn't go on the television, anything. And I said, I just heard an explosion. The building shook. I go, the Twin Towers has a hole in it. I said, I told her it was a bomb. I knew it. I said, well, that's what I thought at the moment. So I told her, I said, they're going to send us to the towers because we're so close. I said, I'll call you when we're done there. That was the exact conversation I had with her. Like I said, I had the quarter in the phone, and she said, we're watching it now in the news. Hung up the phone, went back upstairs. So I went back upstairs, and I was looking at the building. And as I was looking, I saw stuff falling out of the building. So I'm like, wow, what's falling? And I saw a helicopter. So I'm like, what's falling from the building? I wrote about this in my story. I got into it a lot deeper. There wasn't stuff falling. It was people jumping from the buildings.
Yeah.
So I witnessed that. And I couldn't look at it. It was horrible to watch. Worst thing I've ever seen. So I stepped back and I sat at my desk. I said, I can't watch what I was watching. And then sure enough, I got back up. I walked back to the window. As I walked back to the window, I saw something coming from the harbor across Manhattan, coming towards the city. And I couldn't place it. It was behind the building. And I'm looking, and it was the condensation trails of the wings.
Yeah.
I saw it hit the second tower, and I saw it go through the tower and shoot out the front. And there was no sound because the sound didn't get to the building yet. Then I heard the explosion, and my building started shaking where I was. Started shaking, and the windows were shaking, was rattling. So I told everybody, we got to get out of here. This is crazy. I don't know what's going on here today. So I ran to the stairs, and I didn't want to get in an elevator because I figured I'm not getting trapped in an elevator if something happens here. That was the last thing I worried.
Yeah.
So I ran down the stairs, and I don't think I ever had the speed of running down the stairs I did at that moment. There was two detectives running next to me. I don't remember touching the steps. I remembered my hand on the handrail and almost like flipping around each level of stairway. So then I ran past the payphone that I just called my wife from, but I forgot I called her. So I ran outside the building, and I saw a guy I worked with, and he said, what are we going to do? I said, I don't know. Everybody was running out of the building. They were abandoning the building. So I said, let's go a little uptown towards Chinatown where there's no big buildings, because I assumed there was going to be more planes hitting at that moment. So I assumed.
Did you know at that point though? Did you feel as though? Yeah, and you've just said that you feel as though there might be more planes. Did you know what it was? Did you have that? Was it that cop instinct, or what was it that told you, or what was it inside you that made you feel as though actually we need to get away from this?
Well, anyone who's ever dealt with a very traumatic experience, you don't have time to think about anything else but what you're dealing with at that moment in front of you. So you don't think, what are people going to think? What are people going to say? All you say is to yourself is, this is wrong. I got to get out of here. And it's a fight or flight. Yeah. You could probably outrun 100 people. Nobody's going to outrun you at that situation. Your adrenaline kicks in, and it's like an instinct where it says, get yourself to safety, survive this situation. Yeah. So that was me at that moment. I did not think, I knew it was not an accident. Nobody could have told me. Somebody said earlier they thought it was an accident when the first plane. I didn't believe that by the second time. I knew it was a plane because of the condensation trails I saw. I just assumed that's what it was, the wings of the plane. So with this other guy, we were making a fast walk with thousands of people, hundreds, but there was thousands behind us and in front of us, to Chinatown. And as we were walking, I felt the ground under me shaking. So I thought another plane was coming. So I looked at the guy I worked with, and I dove under a parked car. So as I dove under the parked car, it was a woman. I don't know if she dove behind me or she was already there. And we made face contact. And she was an elderly woman. She had such fear in her face, but there was nothing I could say to her. So a guy walked up next to the car, and he said, get off the floor. It's just the subway. So I'm like, what? He goes, it's just the subway. But the floor was rumbling. It didn't make sense. So as I got up, I looked downtown, and I saw the debris heading uptown, which was the tower that just fell. Yeah. So now when I say debris, it was not smoke from a campfire. This was a giant dark curtain of matter just coming uptown. And when it would go uptown, it would go into a street. It would go into a street. It would keep dissipating, but it was coming towards me. So I started running, and that guy that said it was the subway was running even faster than I was. So he realized he was wrong. So I started running, and it was behind me, and the crowd was running with me. The guy, the detective I was with, was next to me. I lost him in the crowd. He was running in one direction. I was running in the other. And then I went a few blocks, and I noticed the subway. Nobody was getting in the subway. Now, obviously, people were leaving Manhattan, but nobody was getting in the subway. So I said to myself, the instinct said, don't go in the subway, because if you get trapped, you don't want to be underground. Figured if something's going to happen, I'm going to be above ground. So I stood there, and there was a woman next to me, and she was talking to me, and I don't remember the whole conversation, but I remember telling her that no matter how long you live, you are going to remember this day for the rest of your life. And I didn't have a cell phone. I couldn't take a picture, nothing. So as the debris was coming uptown, it was dissipating as it was coming. So I didn't get hit with the heavy debris, but it was in front of me, and I saw people running out from it. So something told me, John, you're a cop. You got to go back to One Police Plaza. You can't go any further uptown. You got to help any way you can. So I started walking towards the crowds of thousands of people. As I was walking towards them, they were letting me through. I don't know if they thought I was a cop, because I was not in uniform. I was in a polo shirt, khaki pants. So they started parting, and I was walking through the crowd. And then I focused on a woman that I worked with. She wasn't a police officer. She was a civilian. So I said, where is everybody? She goes, everybody ran out of the building. There's nobody there. So I said, okay, thank you. So I walked to it was federal courthouse. So I got to the federal courthouse, and these court officers came running out, and they had M16s. These guys were armed to the teeth. They were like, who are you? Where are you going? And I took out my police ID. So they said, okay. I said, I got to get back to One Police Plaza. I says, so they said, okay, there's a side entrance. Go back behind the building. You'll get a shortcut. As I'm walking down, somebody was trying to run in the building to get his laptop. So if you can believe while this is all this going on, some guy who all he cared about was his laptop. I saw them actually throw him down the steps. He rolled down the steps. How this guy didn't break his neck, I don't know. He rolled down the steps in a suit, landed on the floor, got up, brushed himself off, and walked away with the crowd like nothing happened. So I said, wow. So I walked behind the courthouse. As I was walking, I got closer to One Police Plaza, and I saw side streets. And I walked down a side street, and there was a whole rows of people sitting on the floor taking oxygen. There's only 2 EMS ambulances giving oxygen. I don't know if the debris just went through there or they just ran from the situation. All I know is that EMS was giving them oxygen. I could breathe fine, so I didn't ask for it. So I was standing there while everybody, was a lot of high school students with masks on their faces, and they were sharing the masks. So as I'm standing there, I see New York City pigeons walking, just dozens of them. I guess that they couldn't fly down from downtown. They guessed that smoke was choking them. So they were just walking the street. So it was like the most oddest thing. I can't explain it, but that's what I saw. And then a woman approaches me, and I don't know if she knew I was a cop. She approaches me and she says, I'm pregnant. I'm afraid I'm going to have my baby right here. So I looked at this woman and I was like, I didn't know what to say. So I said, okay, you were aware EMS is here? So she went over to EMS, and I was like, everybody here can't breathe. So as I was walking, I went up another block, and I was gauging the buildings. And I said, if that building falls, will it land on me? If this building falls, will it land on me? So I went, and I said, this is crazy. But like I said, there was fight or flight. So we went back to One Police Plaza, and the whole plaza was empty. And everybody was gone. Lower Manhattan emptied out so fast. So I went up, and there was a recruit in his gray uniforms. I figured, let me talk to him. Maybe he has something. He saw me, and he started screaming, sir, sir. And I said, stop sirring me. I'm walking over. So I walked over. He didn't know where he was. He was with, I don't know where the rest of his guys were. So he's there, and behind him is the one standing tower. Now, it's still a half mile, but that was the closest I ever made, which was the 0.8 kilometers. So that was the closest I ever made to it. So as I walked up to him, he handed me a paper mask. So he handed me the paper mask, and it was like the hands of time stood still at that moment, because as he handed me the mask, I looked over his shoulder, and I'm showing this on the video right now. I saw the one tower lean in this direction, and then it fell into the tower that was still standing, which was the bottom part of it. And it leaned over, fell into itself. And as it fell down, as it was falling down, the giant debris shot up into the air. And it shot up into the air and shot right back in my direction again. And this time it was different because I was closer, and you could hear it rumbling like an ocean. It was a rumbling sound that was getting louder and louder and louder. And it was thick. And I don't know how I was able to smell it right away. I probably smelled it from the last tower. It smelled like concrete, and burned wires. So that was the smell I had. So I had the mask in my hand. I just took off running, and I could hear it behind me coming behind me, but it was getting louder. And then as I was running, I didn't hear it. So I ran over to a parked car. I was angry. I was banging on the car saying they knocked the towers down. I turned around. There was nobody there. I was yelling to nobody. So I turned around, and I saw the giant wall of smoke. And every once in a while, the sun would creep through, and I'd see people on the Brooklyn Bridge. So I was like, wow, I just kind of missed that cloud. So the debris cloud. So every once in a while, somebody would run through into the plaza, and they would be covered, caked in dust. So I did see 2 more recruits. They would cake. They had a gray uniform on, but they looked gray. They were underneath the debris. So I thought to myself, I could get on that bridge and I could walk home. No one would ever know. I could get out of here. That's when I started to say, you need to think for yourself. But I couldn't do it. It was like part of me was saying, get out, run. And part of me was saying, you have to do your duty. You have to stay here. You have to cannot go any further. So obviously I stayed. I couldn't do that. But the pull to go over that bridge and run to safety was immense. It was peer pressure at 100 times, because it was almost like you had one thing on your shoulder telling you run to over there, and one thing saying stand right here until you figure it out. Yeah. So obviously I stood there. So I stood there, and then I saw they looked like cops. They were in plain clothes. So I walked over to them. We just started talking, and they were cops. And then one guy had this 1,000-mile stare. He couldn't answer what I was asking him about what happened. He just shut down. It was odd, but I guess that's how he was dealing with the situation. And then I was gauging the buildings again around me. I said, if another plane comes, is it going to fall on me? Is it going to hit the building? And then one of my supervisors came out, and he found me, and he said, John, he goes, we were worried about you. You're the last one. We were looking for you. So I was like, okay. So we went another block up, but we had no direction. We were like the forgotten part of Lower Manhattan. It was just emptied out. The phone lines were down. Everything was out. And every once in a while, people would run through the debris, and they would come into One Police Plaza. So I watched this woman run. And she's running right towards me. And I watched her run, and I watched her heel break on her shoe. She wobbles, face plants right in front of me. I was like, whoa. So I tried to pick her up, and then 2 women police officers came out, picked her up, and they ran with her to a little more uptown. So there was a lot of people helping each other at that moment. So then, as I was standing there, I started letting the emergency vehicles downtown. So I started to realize, wow, I had called my wife and told her I was going to the towers. So this was over an hour now. So for an hour, she thought I was in that tower.
Oh, wow.
I was like, oh my gosh, I have to call her. So I told this guy at work, when I go, I'll be right back. I'm going to the payphone. Went to the payphone, didn't work because the phone lines were down. I went to the payphones. The only other choice was to head out of town. So I felt terrible. But my wife at that moment, I could not reach her. And I had no, any of your audience who only grew up with a cell phone needs to realize that. Whoever ended up without a cell phone, it is a different world. So I could not reach her. I found out later on that she crossed more uptown to get out of Lower Manhattan. She never made it to Lower Manhattan. She was uptown, made her cross across the bridge and went uptown. But when she fled with everybody from work, it's the ongoing joke. He called his wife and said hours and never called her back. It's the ongoing joke. But it wasn't. It's like we could laugh about it now. So, story short, it took a long time, but I finally found a payphone that worked, and I was able to first call her job, which there, the message. And then I was able to, I called my father, I called my brother-in-law, and I called 1 or 2 other people. And I told all of them to reach out to her. She wasn't home yet. So it took some time for her to get the information through family members, but it took a couple of hours. That couple of hours, she thought I was in those.
Jeez.
Oh my God. I can't even. No, like you say, looking on, and like you say, you see those images and you think back to them. I can't imagine what it's like experiencing firsthand. But it's something that I don't know. I'm not going to say I think about it on a daily basis, because that simply wouldn't be true. But I think it burned its image onto the back of my eyelids that it's something I've seen that I will never ever forget. And to experience that firsthand and hear that story, It made the hairs on my arm stand up at points listening. I really, really did. Well, I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, I do tell the story because I figured if I witnessed it, I'm a storyteller by nature. Been a storyteller since I was a kid. I was going to tell the story as I saw it, which is what I told you. And there's a little more to it. I got a lot of little more fine details in there. And then I felt that a lot of people were telling the story differently. There are some Hollywood stories that Hollywood put out. And there are definitely people that were in the towers that survived it. And they talked about being in the towers. I described it as I was not in the first row, the second row. I was in the third row of the movie. And when you're in the third row of the movie, you're not too close to the screen, but you're further enough where you could see everything happening at once. So that's kind of was my view of it. And if I had been an eyewitness to that, whether it was a traumatic event or not, I'm going to write about it for others so they don't forget, because you don't want anybody to forget. And the main reason why I write it is there was a lot of people that did not come home that day, that didn't get a chance to go home, and they never got a chance to write about it or tell anybody about it. So that's why I put the story out, and I put it out for free because I never intended to make money off it. I put it out online for free. Anyone who wants to read it, and they could take from it what I saw directly and what I experienced.
Yeah. And where can people find that?
Yeah. You can find it at my website, ferrisinvestigations.org. The story is called In a New York Minute, an Officer's Eyewitness Account of the Events of September 11th, 2001.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for sharing that with us. I don't know what to say after that, Gaza.
No, I mean, it's an event that I suppose transcended the whole world. We were all part of it. I remember exactly where I was when the news hit, and I remember seeing it and all of that. So, just from my point of view, to be talking to somebody that was there sort of firsthand, and as you say, John, you might have been in the third row and you weren't the first or second row, but for somebody that was there to witness that is, I suppose, an incredible sort of memory and an incredible experience, albeit a bad experience. But I just want to say thank you very much for sort of sharing that with us and with our listeners and our viewers and stuff. So I appreciate the story, and I appreciate your time telling that. It's one of those events that certainly stays with me.
100%. Yeah, 100%. So you know exactly now where you can find that story. We should also tell people where we can find your book. So if you have a Kindle, head along to Amazon and have a look. All in a Day's Work by John Farisso. I apologize if I pronounced your surname wrong.
You're very close.
It's close. I'll take that. Yeah. But we'll put a link on our website when we do a blog post about this episode, and we'll put a link in the notes for the audio podcast. So if you're interested, you can click on it there and hopefully pick it up and read it on Amazon Kindle. John, as Gas said, first of all, thank you for sharing that story, but thank you for just enlightening us a little bit about your time in the New York Police Department and your time in internal affairs, missing persons. It's a world that's very alien to us, thankfully, and we really, really have enjoyed learning about it tonight. So, did you want to say your goodbye to our listeners?
Yes, I would like to thank you putting me on a show that's overseas. I mean, obviously in the United States, if New York City, if anyone can't tell from my accent, this is my accent. So I appreciate that you guys are interested in my stories. I think it's great that people are interested in my NYPD stories from something I did 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and especially people in other countries. I know crime is all over the place, but New York City, we see, and the United States in general, we seem like there's a lot going on here and people are interested in it. That's why I talked about it. And in the book, I left out the gore. I left out the cops and robbers. I catch the bad guy, caught him. I talked a lot about the cop humor, how you got to where you were and how you found the situations. I even talked about the days after September 11th in my book. I talked about the next morning and a few days after. I put some interesting stories in there. I wrote my stories all short intentionally to, 1 page to 7 pages. And no story goes with the next. You could pick up one story, I'm a rookie, pick up next story, I'm an investigator. And I decided to write because if I worked that interesting of a career and I had an interesting career, it was worth telling the story.
100% it was. I can tell you that from just listening to those little tidbits that we got tonight. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Gaza?
Yeah, love this episode. Just want to again echo, thank you very much to John, sharing his story, sharing his experiences. It's been amazing, as you said, Adam. We're not privy to that sort of world and what goes on, but just to talk to somebody that it is in a different country to us, but can share those experiences with us. I thank you very much, and I know I've appreciated it. I'm sure our listeners and our viewers will appreciate it. So, again, just a massive, sincere thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to the next time.
Indeed. And like I said, head out there, head to Amazon, pick up the Kindle book, All in Days Work by John Farisso, or there or thereabouts. Click on the link in this audio episode if you're listening to it. So thank you very much for listening. If you have, you've made it all the way through. I don't doubt that you will have done, because it has been a fascinating episode. And we will be back next week with something entirely different again.